Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History. This is continuing of Unit 4. We're going to take a look now at the second part of Chapter 5. In our first part of I'm so sorry. In our first part of Chapter 5, we took a look at the origins of the transatlantic slave trade. We looked at the Middle Passage. We looked at its impact on the Americas, on Europe, and on Africa. And today we're going to look specifically at kind of the lives of enslaved people in the Americas. We're going to look at the plantation system. We're going to look at the division of labor. We're going to look as well at cultures being developed among African communities, among people of African descent. And we'll actually conclude with a happy note. We'll talk about the eventual abolition movement. We'll talk about the movement to end slavery and the horrors that we've mentioned and looked at in our past chapters and in this current one, as we'll see in a second. So this is part 2 of chapter 5. It's continuing on those topics, 4.5 and 4.6, although you could make an argument this also goes into 4.7. How have social roles and categories been maintained or changed over time? And especially that social role is slavery. So yes, today we are going to look at the experience of enslaved people in the New World. And by the way, the bell work, if you're watching in the year of our Lord 2022, it is a little different than what's on your bell work sheet. Unfortunately, I switched around, not realizing that our last chapter that we would probably have ended talking about the transatlantic slave trade and not about the experiences of enslaved people. And today, that's what we are going to look at. We are going to look at the experience of enslaved people a little bit. This is something you will look at more in your AP US history class, but nonetheless is important to understand not only American society, meaning the United States, but also, of course, Latin American and Caribbean societies as well. So we're going to look first at kind of the social organization of these areas that are going to be dominated by slave labor. And we are going to look at a specific term known as a plantocracy. And a plantocracy is going to describe essentially these major slave-owning societies that the colonial empires of Europe will create in North and South America. We especially are going to see these plantocracies, these societies dominated by this institution of slavery economically and socially in places across the Caribbean, in islands like Cuba, Hispaniola, Santo Domingo for the Spanish. But there's also going to be a significant slave presence, of course, in Brazil, as we explored with the Portuguese. In the southern United States, in modern-day United States, of course, slavery is also a major component, not only economically in terms of the plantation economy, but also in terms of social organization. Slaves and enslaved people, people of African descent in general, tend to be on the bottom of these societies. But in many cases, they often outnumber white planters. And a few terms just to define before we explore slave societies a bit more. A planter, that describes kind of the elite. These are the richest slave owners. They're the ones who dominate colonial government, the economy, society in general. The hierarchy of these societies tends to be this racial hierarchy, which will heavily favor European planters, people of European descent, I should say. These Creoles, oftentimes born in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and North and South America. And certainly, this is kind of also described as a slaveocracy, meaning that these enslaved people, these enslavers, so the people at the top, tend to be the dominant social class. So if we're thinking about how have economic systems transformed social structures, the unit objective, well, here's another example of that. So yes, the societies across the Americas, especially in the sugar and tobacco and cotton producing regions of North and South America, these places tend to be dominated by slavery. Slavery is the primary labor system. It's also the primary social hierarchy as well. It tends to be kind of rich white people, poor white people, free enslaved people, or free people of African descent, enslaved African descent. And even though there are, in some cases, examples of free people of color, of those gentlemen of color, to use the French term, the gens de couleur, we do see that free people of color are still subject to that racial hierarchy. African Americans, in this case meaning people born in the Americas, tend to be discriminated against. They are outlawed, or they are prevented from participating in colonial government. There are some exceptions, of course, especially in Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies. But we also do see a legal system that does tend to discriminate against people of African origin, something that will continue to this day, of course. So we looked generally at kind of society, and we'll look at the experience of free people of color a bit more towards the end of today. But what generally is going to characterize the lives of enslaved people? Well, first we're going to look at the labor kind of organization. We're looking first at the economic involvement that slaves have in these plantation economies. And then we're going to look at society, social hierarchies, so looking at religion, and then finally, ways slaves resisted their enslavement. So in terms of kind of the economy and where exactly slaves fit in this, well, mostly we do see that societies in the southern United States, in the southern British North American colonies, societies in the Caribbean and Brazil, they're mostly going to be characterized by this plantation system. And a plantation, to put it very simply, is a large, self-sufficient farm, basically, that is going to produce cash crops that demand physical labor. And there are various kind of cash crops that are grown in North and South America. These cash crops are things you don't need necessarily for life, basically, is what a cash crop is. And they include things like tobacco, indigo, coffee, rice, later on in the 19th century, cotton, but the biggest and most important for us in world history is sugar. Sugar is one of the most highly demanded products in North and South, well, across the world, I should say, especially in European markets. Remember, Europe is undergoing a commercial revolution, meaning that there is more interest in trade. There's more interest in international trade, in the selling of luxury goods that are produced oftentimes using slave labor, such as sugar. Sugar is an extremely valuable commodity. It is one of the kind of biggest cash crops produced in the Caribbean and in South America. But it is an extremely labor-intensive process. You wouldn't need to know exactly how it's made, but I'm going to describe it to kind of illustrate this point of extreme labor conditions. If we were in class, you would watch a video describing the process of sugar production. But essentially, it goes like this. It essentially is going to involve a very strict timing process, because when sugar cane is cut, and it's going to be cut using machetes oftentimes, when it's cut, it only has a certain amount of time before the juices within the sugar cane actually go bad, before it needs to be processed. And the process of harvesting the sugarcane itself is extremely physically demanding. It's going to involve massive amounts of laborers, in this case, obviously enslaved people. And using kind of this sugarcane, it's going to be processed in boiling rooms, in sugar mills, as they were called. And the sugar mills themselves are extremely dangerous. It often involves kind of a process that it would squeeze out these juices from the sugarcane. And the process of this kind of squeezing out is very brutal itself, because after almost 18-hour days in many cases for enslaved people, this would also involve their work at the sugar mills. And as you would have watched in the video, which I'm not going to show in this presentation, sometimes this it could involve enslaved people accidentally kind of getting trapped in this mechanism. And oftentimes at these sugar mills, they would have a hatchet or a machete that was intended to cut off limbs. So it is an extremely brutal, but also extremely physically demanding process as well. So this is important to understand because it is going to help us explain why there was such a demand for African labor, for enslaved labor in general. This enslaved labor was needed, you could say, economically speaking, for the constant upkeep of sugar production. Morally, of course, we know that this is terrible, obviously, and economically, there are other systems that could have worked. But it is going to explain why there was such a demand for enslaved labor. If it couldn't be done through enslaved Native Americans, if it couldn't be done through indentured servants from Europe, it was done through African labor. But the impact of these plantations goes well beyond just the physical conditions that enslaved people underwent, but it would also devastate the natural environment of the Caribbean, and it continues to this day. Sugar is a very highly demanded product, and it is going to be largely grown in Caribbean island nations, even to this day. But the environmental devastation of sugar is felt in a variety of different ways. For one thing, the constant production of sugar is going to deplete the soil of many Caribbean island societies. And of course, in Brazil as well, it's going to require further and further destruction of native plants. It's going to require deforestation. And actually, this soil depletion is so terrible that really no other products, no other plants are grown in these Caribbean islands sometimes. Sometimes this food needs to be imported from the mainland, from the haciendas of Mexico, from the rice growing plantations of the Carolinas, for example, in North America for the British colony system. So we do kind of see this environmental devastation as a result of this intense demand of sugar production. And we can also say that this is a result of the Columbian Exchange, is going to be environmental devastation of native plant species in favor of those from Europe or from the old world, to use those terms. And this, we're not going to watch the documentary, but it does actually describe both the history of sugar production as it relates to modern day conditions of sugar workers. Sugar workers, even to this day, and we'll explore this more in future units towards the era of globalization, still continue to face very harsh conditions, even though slavery obviously is no more. Racial hierarchies still exist, but also these physical demanding jobs. But in terms of kind of hierarchies and divisions of enslaved people, we have to first look at kind of different hierarchies that will form within slave society that are imposed by enslavers. First is going to be kind of a distinction between those slaves of African descent born within the Americas, quote unquote, Creole slaves, and the quote unquote saltwater slaves. These are slaves imported from Africa, newly imported from Africa. And Creole slaves tend to kind of be people that have survived the grueling conditions of both the Middle Passage, of course, but also of the enslaved environment of the plantations themselves. We do see there will be kind of a hierarchy that is emerging that enslavers will impose on these enslaved groups. Oftentimes, Creole slaves tend to be favored or preferred, you could say, by enslavers, whereas saltwater slaves are viewed as more expendable, to use very harsh terms like that. But another way we do see the imposition of hierarchies on enslaved groups is through the division of labor. And this has a gender component, as we'll see in a second. But kind of to use some AP World History terms, there is this distinction between quote unquote skilled and unskilled labor. Basically, the way to think about this is work that requires training, work that doesn't require training. I think all labor, of course, is skilled, but it is this kind of more technical term. And there are different ways that enslavers, that planters would kind of create these social divisions and labor divisions. And it's through various systems of organizing enslaved lives, of regimenting their lives to produce cash crops. The first was something known as the caste system. And this was the most used system of division of labor. Essentially, it would involve enslavers assigning roles or tasks to different slaves, to different enslaved people. And if this task was done, well, that's what was demanded from that enslaver. So it is going to kind of divide enslaved people into different categories. Sometimes there's training of enslaved people as blacksmiths. Remember, a plantation is self-sufficient in many ways. It wants to not require importing of manufactured products. So we do see that there is a division into different assignments, into different tasks by enslavers. But according to some accounts of enslaved people and by abolitionists that we'll talk about later, there is this kind of idea that sometimes plantations, sometimes planters would divide their labor into something known as the gang system. And essentially, the gang system would be kind of organizing workers based on age group, based on physical characteristics. So we do have the kind of different gangs that are involved. There's the first gang. These are considered the strongest, mostly male enslaved people. The second gang is going to be mostly kind of older men, younger men, kind of preteens, young enslaved men. These would be these types of men. They would be involved in kind of collecting fallen sugar, of transporting it to sugar mills. And then finally, there's the so-called grass gang. These are very young children, so toddlers, of course. Even children were involved in this enslavement process, but also women as well. These groups of people would do tasks kind of following up on these different gangs, including weeding and harvesting and hoeing, these sorts of things. And sometimes rarely, this is rare, but we would, comparatively, the primary use of enslaved labor was for agricultural production. But we also do see enslaved people being used as domestic workers as well. And domestic workers, kind of the terrible side of that, would be constant presence in a white household. And that could lead to instances of abuse, sexually, physically, etc., by enslavers against enslaved people. It is a very brutal system, no matter where an enslaved person is. And I think it's important to understand the violence that is associated with slavery inherently, because how do you make someone work for you, deny their rights, deny any possibility? It's through the intimidation of violence and through the actual performance of violence. And this relates actually to this idea of gender and the status of women in enslaved societies as well. Women were expected to perform manual labor, of course, alongside men, but oftentimes women had the equal responsibility of caring for enslaved children as well, for nursing, etc., those sorts of things. And of course, kind of there is this idea of intersectionality as well, that women of African descent were not only subject to a racial hierarchy, but also to a very patriarchal hierarchy as well. So a very dehumanizing existence for a lot of enslaved women. And I think we saw that with our discussion of the Middle Passage, that sexual abuse was common and took place. And it is going to be something that does define a lot of the legacy of what we'll talk about in future units of African American women, of people of color, of women of color especially. And you'll explore this a lot more in your US history class. And unfortunately, we kind of paint very broad terms in our class. But of course, kind of a big component of slavery in the New Worlds is going to be the high mortality rates that is associated with it. Sugar is a very physically demanding cash crop, same with all these cash crops. And we are going to see a lot of combinations of things that will lead to a very high mortality rate. The life expectancy for a man, for an enslaved man in the Caribbean in this time period, was about 23. So if that's any indication of these extremely brutal work and living conditions, because it wasn't just heavy work or harsh punishments, but poor nutrition, disease was very rampant and common, in enslaved communities, mostly because enslavers could just import more African slaves. And we do actually see that in Caribbean and Brazil plantations, that there is a low, what we would call natural increase rate, that there is little in the way of kind of a natural increase rate, meaning birth rate among enslaved families, among enslaved women. The exception actually is British North America, and that's not because of quote unquote better treatment. I think some people kind of assume that, but it's mostly because of this interest in creating the most profitable system so that you don't have to import more enslaved people. So it is a very brutal system that is associated with making sure there's enough enslaved laborers. And remember, one of the things that makes New World slavery different from what we see in the African and Middle Eastern countries of this time is that slavery and the status of slavery was inheritable. It is what we'll see in a second is matrilineal, meaning what your mom was, so is the child. So if a mother was an enslaved person, the child is an enslaved person as well. And again, kind of to illustrate the big theme of this particular slide right here is that this high mortality rate is going to further increase the transatlantic slave trade. We saw the impact of the transatlantic slave trade in the previous presentation. We saw the sheer statistic of how many people are forced across the Atlantic Ocean into the New World. It was 12 million in the period between 1500 and 1850. In terms of kind of social hierarchies beyond what are imposed directly by enslavers, we have to also look at family institutions among enslaved people as well. Especially this is true for places where there is a focus on quote unquote Christianizing Africans, in creating kind of the conditions of a Christian approved marriage and family structure. Is that even though there will be this expectation that African slaves are to adopt European ideas of religion and family and gender structures, that this was often not even respected by these enslavers. We do see that oftentimes there was not a recognition of slave marriages. This is especially true in British North America, in British colonies. And we do see that families are often broken up, that husbands and wives, they could be sold into slavery, into separate areas away from where their mothers and fathers are, that children could be sold into slavery and sold into a different plantation, I should say. And again, kind of there's this idea that the status of slavery is matrilineal, that it is inheritable. And that is a huge difference from the slavery that we see in West Africa prior to the 1500s, that slavery in African societies is not inheritable. And it's not necessarily racially based, whereas in the New World, it definitely is. But we're kind of working our way off towards a more positive ending for this particular chapter of our AP class, is that we are going to see there are instances of resistance, of course, that's going to take hold in a variety of different ways, but one actually is in religion. Because one of the kind of motivations for many of these European societies was quote unquote Christianizing people in West Africa, even though West Africa probably has a stronger tradition of Christianity than perhaps Europe does. But we do see that there is a way that slaves are going to resist, at least culturally, by not exactly following the European definition of Christianity. And we do see that religion among African slaves is going to be an example of syncretism. And probably the most familiar, most recognizable is going to be what develops within within Caribbean slave societies, within societies across the Caribbean basis. And we do see kind of a blending of different influences of Catholicism, of West African traditions, of indigenous traditions from the islands of the Caribbean, Also, a little bit of Islam. Remember, Islam is a big religion in West Africa. And all of these kind of religious traditions will be kind of blended together to create Voodoo, or as it's more commonly known as voodoo. Now, this is a prime example of not only a way that slaves are resisting, they are creating their own forms of cultural identity separate from their European enslavers, from their enslavers of European descent, but they are also developing a sort of cultural connection, a way to feel a sense of community in very harsh, terrible, to put it lightly, conditions. This idea of Afro-American culture is something that is a result of this transatlantic slave trade, the creation of an African descent, of a culture among people of African descent in the various colonial societies of North and South America. And continuing on this idea of how religion is a way to resist, we have to also look at other forms of resistance. We'll see this dramatically, you could say, in form of rebellion, but there are other more subtle means of resistance as well, as we kind of illustrated with the example of Voodoo in many Caribbean slave communities. But something that is important to understand, and I think sometimes we fall into this trap of thinking, why didn't they resist? Well, they did resist, of course. And we do see slave resistance in forms of violence. We do see slave rebellions. But what is important to understand about slave rebellions in the New World is that they are relatively rare, and that they are relatively not successful, at least insofar as slavery, of course, will not end. We'll look at some exceptions to that in the future in Unit 5. But there are different slave rebellions that will occur, and they are examples of resistance against colonial powers. And this is something the AP would want you to understand, and I think is also important to understand for your broader understanding of world history. There were slave rebellions, and I have a few examples right here across North America, not just by enslaved people of African descent, but also indigenous Native Americans as well, in terms of African descent enslaved people who will rebel. We have Gasper's Rebellion in colonial Mexico. That's the first kind of documented organized slave rebellion among people of African descent. There's Tacky's War in Jamaica, in the British colony of Jamaica. But there's also, if we're thinking about indigenous enslaved people, we have Pueblo Revolt, the Pueblo Revolt in modern day New Mexico, actually. And we'll learn about that more in AP US history. But these are examples of slave resistance through the form of the use of violence. A way to counter this inherently violent system is through violent resistance. However, the important thing to understand, though, is that these rebellions oftentimes would be met with very brutal repression. I actually, in college, studied the 1811 German Coast Uprising in the United States, and it was very brutally put down. Oftentimes, kind of this was used, this brutal suppression was used to intimidate enslaved people from openly rebelling. So while slave rebellions did, and they did occur, it was not necessarily the most common way of resistance. We'll talk about a successful slave rebellion in the form of the Haitian Revolution. That will be in our 5th unit, in Unit 5, actually. But in terms of kind of more everyday resistance, there's this idea of subtle or passive resistance, however you want to say it. And that could take a form in a variety of different ways. You have running away, simply kind of leaving a site of enslavement, a plantation, and looking for, well, freedom outside of European society, of European colonial society. But this could even happen, this subtle resistance could happen in the form of breaking tools, not showing up on time, even things like spitting in food or something like that. It's important to understand slaves kept their identity in these kind of passive or subtle means of resistance. Slaves obviously did not accept their enslavement. And you'll actually read a historian about this a lot more next year in your US history class. But if we're thinking about kind of this idea of resistance, a kind of specific term that's important to understand is this idea of a maroon society. And a maroon society essentially is a community of runaway enslaved people. These maroon societies appeared all across the Caribbean basin, all across Brazil, even to a degree parts of the southern United States, the southern British North American colonies. And these maroon societies were a constant kind of thorn in the side of enslavers who owned these plantations across the Caribbean basin. So the maroon societies are an example of enslaved resistance to slavery. But we also see kind of that enslaved people could work their way towards freedom. This was extremely rare. It's extremely rare, and it's even more unheard of in English colonies, in those of the modern day United States, of Jamaica, etc. But we have this process known as manumission. And manumission essentially describes a system in which an enslaver would grant, through some legal means, freedom to a enslaved person. And manumission could take a variety of different forms. It could be kind of that an enslaver says in his will, or their will, I guess, that I'm going to free all of my slaves. And that's something actually that figures like George Washington, to use a modern or a US example, will do in his will. But there's also this idea that enslaved people could buy their freedom. And this was seen as the most economically beneficial for enslavers, that they could enslave people, meaning they could grow crops on the side to sell at the market. But again, kind of there was varying systems of controls against enslaved people that might prevent this in colonies, especially those English ones. Generally, there tends to be kind of a less rigid racial hierarchy. It's not completely not rigid, but there tends to be a less rigid hierarchy in Spanish, French, and Portuguese colonies. But even if freedom was obtained by any variety of means, through manumission, through these maroon societies, by running away, by purchasing one's freedom, free people of color were still subject to racial hierarchies. And oftentimes, sometimes, they were encouraged to leave a certain society, a certain settlement. So we do see that free people of color were still subject to racist institutions. Even if they managed to break free of slavery, they're still at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. But another way we do see resistance to slavery, both by enslaved people and not enslaved, people, is going to be through abolition movements. And abolition essentially describes the movement to end slavery, to end both the slave trade, but also the slavery itself. And the influence of abolition movements kind of connects us to what we discussed in terms of the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment, although a lot of it is mostly limited to very wealthy white men, it is going to have kind of a side effect of influencing movements for equality, especially among different groups of racial minorities, but also among women, etc. So we do see that the Enlightenment and its insistence on natural rights, that's going to be logically, in some cases, or well, amongst abolitionists, applied to people of African descent as well, that there shouldn't be any slavery because all men are created equal, to borrow the term of actually an enslaver, of course. But there's also religious influence on abolition movements. John Wesley is a good example. In England, he's the founder of Methodism. So we do see that there are different abolitionists, different people who are advocating for the end of slavery. We have John Wesley, William Wilberforce in the English kind of world, But we also have to use American examples, people like Harriet Tubman, people like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. So there are different movements to end slavery, to demand emancipation and the ending of the slave trade. And these abolition movements are going to be successful by the mid 1800s. We are going to see a decline in slavery, largely thanks to political and social movements by abolitionists made up of free African Americans, made up of enslaved African people of African descent, and by people who are against slavery in general. And there are some just dates that I have right here of kind of when slavery is ending in certain places. By 1807, for example, the slave trade, the legal slave trade, will be over by 1807. By the 1820s, many Latin American countries after independence have abolished slavery. The United States will abolish slavery thanks to the for the most part, thanks to the 13th Amendment. There was a whole civil war about it. You talk about it in A-Push a little bit. Well, not a little bit. You spend a whole unit on it. And then the last country actually to formally abolish chattel slavery is going to be Brazil by the 1880s, 1888. However, despite the fact that slavery will eventually be abolished, and we'll, of course, talk about this more in our 5th unit, so our next unit, but even though slavery is abolished, that does not mean immediate or even, that does not mean racial equality. That does not mean that people of African descent are fully integrated into many of these post-colonial societies in North and South America. And we'll explore that a little bit more in our next unit when we discuss what life is like after independence in North and South America. That's one of the big continuities, is that these racial hierarchies are established during our time period right now, but they're going to definitely continue well into the 21st century. So you should be able to answer this question right here. How did enslaved people resist slavery? And I want you also to think about how slave labor impacted colonial societies, and think about in a variety of different ways. Think about the environment, social relations, culture, politics, etc. All right. So that concludes this particular chapter of Unit 4. And we're going to actually wrap up Unit 4 by going outside of the Americas, and we're going to look at Japan, and we're going to look at China. We're going to look at the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, then we're going to look at the Qing dynasty in China, and that will wrap up Unit 4. That will actually bring an end to my Unit 4, well, obviously, but the Semester 1 videos that I have. So have a good day. Hope you learned something. Goodbye.